Today, we'll outline the plot of a 2016 sci-fi thriller movie called Infinity Chamber. Sit back, relax and enjoy. The movie opens with Frank Lerner getting ganked from behind by two men. They tase him and he crumples to the floor. Frank wakes up feeling dazed and confused. When he looks around, he sees a mysterious spinning device. He's trapped in a space-age looking cell that was clearly put together by an edgy interior decorator who was only into black. His abductors were kind enough to leave him one comfortable looking chair at least. Frank's eyes are no longer blurry and we get a proper look at the spinning device, the titular Infinity Chamber. A camera pops out of the roof and startles Frank. He is way too easy to sneak up on from behind. Even if you put 0 points into sneak, he still wouldn't notice you. A robotic voice speaks to Frank and exchanges pleasantries. The bot introduces himself as
Call me Howard.
And says that he is Frank's life support officer. We get a view of Frank's cell from Howard's control room. Joseph Fritzl vibes intensify. Frank asks Howard why he is in the cell, but Howard gives him vague answers and says he is just responsible for acclimating him to ISN habitat. The ISN is a corrupt government organization that rules Frank's world through technological superiority. Frank asks if he has been arrested by the ISN and what his charges are. Howard says he's not being charged with anything. He is being processed, a phone call or a lawyer. Howard, as helpful as ever, says I don't think so. Frank asks Howard what his job is. He responds that it is simply to keep Frank alive, then asks if they should get started. In a flashback, Frank wakes up in his home and checks his clock. Back in the cell, Howard is attempting to make small talk with Frank. He offers him flavored waters, asks if he wants to listen to music. Then asks if he wants to stretch his legs. Frank leaps at the opportunity to go for a walk so he can maybe find a way to escape the facility. Howard appears to open the door for him but instead brings a treadmill into his cell, further ruining Frank's day. Frank asks how long he is going to be detained. In classic Howard fashion, Howard answers, until you are processed. In the flashback, Frank is now taking a shower. He enters a pin code into a panel and looks surprised when it dispenses what appears to be a large key. He gives his good boy some food and a pat. Back in the cell, Howard tells Frank that he was born in Austin, Texas, but grew up in a small town outside of Seattle. Frank tells Howard that his dog is locked in his apartment and that he will die if Howard doesn't contact someone and let them know. Howard says that's horrible, but then says he can't contact anyone because that's not how the program works. In the flashback, Frank travels on a train, then encounters a man and hurries down an alley, covering his face when a drone flies over. Back in the cell, Howard asks Frank why he urinated on the floor. Frank asks where he was supposed to go because Howard didn't give him a bucket. The massive troll Howard says. Next time he should just ask to use the bathroom. A door opens up, showing a bathroom, further frustrating Frank. When he goes in, the door slams shut and we hear mechanical sounds coming from his room. When it unlocks, Frank discovers that the urine on the floor has mysteriously been cleaned. I wish my house had this feature. In the flashback, Frank enters a restaurant. He orders a coffee from the barista. Back in the cell, Frank dispenses disgusting-looking vegetable soup into a bowl. It tastes even worse than it looks, but Howard assures Frank that it has all the vitamins he needs. When Frank asks Howard if he has ever tasted the soup, Howard responds that he doesn't have that information. Howard's robotic responses are starting to make Frank suspicious, and he starts saying Howard repeatedly. It doesn't matter if Frank screams or whispers Howard. Howard still replies with the same deadpan, "Yes, Frank?" Frank comes to the horrifying realization that Howard is a computer. He asks Howard why he lied about being born in Texas and raised near Seattle. Howard responds that he wasn't technically lying because he was built in Austin but programmed outside of Seattle. In the flashback, the barista tries to guess Frank's name, calling him Larry, then Pete, then Dave. Frank turns to look at photographs framed on the wall and she informs him that she took them herself. She asks to hold his hand and finally guesses Frank. Frank is impressed with Gabby's fourth-time lucky clairvoyancy. He turns to look at the photos when the two men from the opening scene appear and tase him. Back in the cell, Frank wakes up and approaches the Infinity Chamber. It sends him straight back to the flashback in the restaurant where Gabby is asking if he likes her photographs. She asks for his hand again and guesses Frank. Frank is spooked and loses his cool but ends up getting tased again, this time actually feeling the pain of being shot back in his cell. It seems the Infinity Chamber has the ability to force you to relive the same memory in a Groundhog Day meets Inception and the Matrix mashup. He asks Howard what the spinning device is. Howard gives a typical useless response, saying he assumed it was ventilation. Howard tells Frank that he found an error in Frank's transfer codes to the facility and that there may be a way Frank can contact a human facilitator. All they have to do is break something in the cell which will issue a repair request and alert a supervisor. They decide that Frank will break Howard's camera. Only problem is that Howard is programmed to trigger security response systems if he knows Frank is trying to damage him. Frank asks Howard to get him a coffee, then uses the opportunity to launch a surprise attack. Alarms sound and the room fills with gas, knocking Frank unconscious. When he comes to, He is strapped to a stretcher and being shuttled through the facility where ISN staff administer an injection. Frank is now back in the memory. Gabby sees that he is feeling despondent and offers him a free coffee. Just like the other memories, she attempts to guess his name. Frank is confused that the men who usually capture him haven't arrived and figures out that it's because he didn't pay for his drink this time, so the ISN identity scanner on the wall couldn't detect him. He takes a look at ISN hardware attached to the counter and orders a coffee to trigger the scanner. The ID that appears isn't Frank, so the ISN seems to have confused him with someone else. The two men appear as anticipated and Frank is shocked back into reality in the cell. Frank attempts to explain to Howard that he is being detained because the ISN has mixed up his identity, but Howard says it's impossible for bioscan hardware to make a mistake. Frank can't remember the ID number from the memory, so he pulls up a chair near the chamber and gets ready to go back in to find it. Things don't go according to the usual sequence this time. We hear electricity and see explosions in the distance. Back in the cell, alarms sound and the power is cut off. Howard is offline, so Frank no longer has access to food or water. He hears banging coming from the cell next door and we meet Fletcher May, the head of the Alliance which opposes the ISN. Fletcher tells Frank that the Alliance crashed the ISN network. The two men desperately try to dig out of their respective cells. Fletcher teaches Frank a method to trick the infinity chamber. He needs to conjure up a real vivid memory but replace one of the items in the memory with a Frank remembers his father cooking pancakes, but replaces them with waffles. This way the ISN will be, as Fletcher puts it, in the right house, but they kick down the wrong door, so won't be able to get any useful information out of Frank's memories. As the days pass, the men slowly lose hope of being rescued or escaping, and Fletcher says he is going to choose his own path, inferring that he is going to commit suicide. This triggers an alarm and gas floods the cells. Frank wakes up in his cell where everything seems to have gone back to normal. Howard appears and introduces himself as a life support operator and asks Frank his name. Howard has been rebooted and does not recall ever interacting with Frank. Back in the memory, Gabby no longer guesses his name and directly addresses him as Frank, indicating that the memories are not isolated events that repeat but possibly an entire memory world. When another customer orders a drink, Frank hides behind the counter to avoid being detected by the ISN scanner. He tells Gabby that the coffee shop isn't real and that she is just a part of his memory. She thinks he is crazy and says that's the most elaborate story she's ever heard to get a free cup of coffee. Because Frank didn't trigger the ISN scanner and alert the men with tasers, he spends many hours in the coffee shop memory. We see him in a desert with his comfortable chair from the cell in another memory. Here he attempts his best impersonation of Rodin's sculpture The Thinker. The lines between reality and memory begin to blur as we follow Frank in his apartment, in the cell and with Gabby. Is he slowly mastering Fletcher's technique of manipulating the flashback device by creating false memories? The two men arrive at the coffee shop for their scheduled Frank tasing, but Frank and Gabby attack them and knock them to the ground. Frank interrogates one of the men and asks why they are after him, but he does not respond. Frank tells Gabby to let them go. Gabby asks why, as they could have known something. Frank says that because they're part of his memory he knows that they don't know anything. Gabby is hurt that, by extension, Frank still sees the coffee shop and her as a figment of his imagination, but the two have grown close and she says that they will figure it out no matter how long it takes. Back in the cell, Frank notices that Howard is malfunctioning and periodically powers down for a period of just over 12 seconds. He tells Gabby that he plans to escape the ISN facility that day. The wall is covered in a complex array of escape plans. Gabby is concerned that if Frank escapes he will never see her again. She asks him to come and find her and get her to the real world, if one exists. Frank pays for his coffee and kisses Gabby before the ISN guards arrive. Back in the cell, Frank waits for Howard to power down, then quickly covers him with a bag. When Howard regains power, he immediately triggers the defense system and floods the cell with sleeping gas. Frank has covered his mouth and waits for the doors to open, evading a support robot that was sent to the cell, and he escapes. Frank climbs a ladder and opens a hatch, finding himself in a desolate landscape. He encounters a field of wind turbines and eventually ends up at an empty gas station and grabs a bottle of water. He sees Gabby's photographs on the walls and realizes that he never actually escaped. He is still trapped in the cell with Howard. Howard offers him breakfast and coffee, but he is malfunctioning since the Alliance attack and none of these systems work anymore. He begs Howard to let him out, stating that letting him die is against Howard's primary objective as a life support officer. Frank reveals that he is part of the Alliance and that he built the virus that crashed the ISN system. He knew all about the Infinity Chamber before he was arrested, so he intentionally hid the virus's location deep in his memory so the ISN could not find it before it had a chance to take effect. Frank asks Howard for some music and prepares to hang himself. Howard pleads with him to stop.
Please stop.
As does Gabby in his memory.
Frank, wake up!
A rescue robot arrives and cuts him down, and Frank manages to escape the cell with Howard's help. He makes it to the empty control room and has an emotional farewell with Howard before powering him off permanently. Frank climbs the ladder again. This time, it's snowing. Frank descends a mountain and stumbles upon the scene that Gabby photographed. He is rescued by some hikers, and the news reports that Frank was the sole survivor of an ISN detainment center that was abandoned by all personnel nearly 2 years ago. The ISN regime has since fallen, and a newsreader welcomes Frank back to the new world. Frank makes his way to Gabby's coffee shop and takes the key, which is actually a flash drive that contains the virus, from behind her photograph. Just like in his memories, Gabby asks if he likes her photographs and tells him that she took them herself. He throws the flash drive in the trash, his mission of taking down the ISN now completed. He thanks Gabby for the coffee, but she says that her name is Madeline. She guesses Frank's name incorrectly as usual. As Madeline continues to try and guess Frank's name, the camera pans out and we see a surveillance camera that looks remarkably like Howard.